Bet the Board in conjunction with Nascar presents Stay Green. Stay Green is your first stop for all the metrics, matchups, and money-making opportunities at the track each race week. This is Stay Green, the NASCAR betting podcast. Here are your hosts, Todd Furman and racing analyst Chris Wormy.
Welcome into the inaugural episode of the Stay Green podcast. It's all about NASCAR betting, and I know a lot of you guys out there thinking to yourselves, we know nothing about betting autos. That's what we're here to help with in conjunction with NASCAR. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined by racing analyst and a man who will inevitably be a household name by the time we know who the next Cup champion is in early November. And we'll get his background a little bit as we go, but want to introduce him to you first and foremost. Chris Wormy. You can follow Chris on Twitter at cwormy15. And Worm, are you ready for this responsibility, trying to make NASCAR betting something that's going to be household vernacular?
Yeah, I'm super excited. Obviously, it's something I'm super passionate about, and to get to do it with a friend, and especially an interesting season. I mean, we have some interesting things going on. There's multiple storylines. I think it's going to be an especially exciting rest of the season from here on out.
There is so much ground to cover, and just to kind of introduce a lot of our listeners to the format that we made here too, of course, we'll diverge here and there. Most of the time at the top of each show, we'll recap the race that we saw last just to kind of fill people in, as we know everybody doesn't stay glued to their sets to watch 300, 400, or 500 laps every Saturday or Sunday. We'll try and introduce a topic in the middle of the show about how we handicap NASCAR and some of the key metrics and terminology that you may not be familiar with. And last but certainly not least, we'll talk about the race coming up for the weekend. And just so you guys get a little bit of an idea on the cadence, we're recording these shows on Wednesday. They'll go live on Friday. So if there's information that may have changed between recording and the time the show goes live, we'll do our best to try and inform you on social media. So encourage all of you, as always, to Bet the Board branded podcast. So I want you guys to sign up, subscribe, rate, review, and you'll look for the Stay Green logo, which will be a little bit different than a lot of the college football and NFL content that you've grown accustomed to. And Worm, before we get into kind of the season in review, talking about parity and a lot of the things we've seen, why don't you give all of our loyal listeners, those folks who may have found us for the first time via NASCAR, a little bit of a background in how you got into betting NASCAR and why you've stuck with it for as long as you have?
I'm from a small town in Michigan, a pretty conservative place. I wasn't really exposed to gambling at all growing up, and even in through college, I'd never placed a bet in my entire life.
That's disappointing. We're going to have to try and change that. When you become this NASCAR sensation, you're going to have to tell people you were betting races, trying to hustle at short tracks from the time you were 8 years old.
Yeah, I know. I just didn't do it. I've just kind of been a risk-averse guy, pretty conservative my entire life, and that all changed when I graduated from college and I moved out to Scottsdale, Arizona, and started caddying at a golf course there. And man, let me tell you, that changed my life when it comes to gambling. You want to talk about culture shock? I mean, it was pretty drastic. But after a couple years of caddying, I moved in with a guy that a roommate, and he loved NASCAR, and he was a big sports bettor, and I thought he had an edge. I was like, wow, this is pretty impressive. This guy's kind of consistently winning. So I remember I bet the first NASCAR race I ever bet on was when Jamie McMurray won the Daytona 500. And I remember I made $240, and you would have thought I won the lottery. I've never been so happy in my life to win a bet. And man, come a long way since then. I think one thing that, I think all professional bettors do is they don't have a vice. I don't go out and handicap football. I just kind of stay in my lane. And NASCAR is the one thing I think I have a clear edge. And so I kind of stay there, and it's worked out great. I do some IndyCar, some Formula One, but for the most part, it's NASCAR.
And of course, if we see some value, when you talk about NASCAR, it's not just the Cup Series. You obviously spend a ton of time handicapping the trucks and the Xfinity. So throughout the course of these podcasts, we're going to do everything we can to kind of peel back that curtain a little bit and give you guys a look behind the scenes in terms of what goes into making the process, how we arrive at a lot of our investments, and some of the things that you can be doing on your own as you familiarize yourself with the sport. One story, Worm, that we'll get to, and I don't want to share it all here now. We can discuss how I got into NASCAR betting and exactly how you and I ended up becoming acquaintances and working together. But we'll save that for a different show going forward with so much ground to cover here. And when you look at this season so far, we knew the big storyline coming in was about the next-gen car. People had talked about parity. You've been following NASCAR even longer than I have, and one of the things you get before every season is, oh, well, this season's going to be different. There are going to be a lot more teams in the mix. There's going to be a lot more drivers that can win. And inevitably, what we see is that the power teams, whether it be HMS or JGR or Stewart-Haas in their heyday, etc., those are the drivers consistently vying for the checkered flag. Well, lo and behold, this season, I don't think any of us really believed we were going to have 12 winners through 16 races, where 16 drivers are going to make the playoffs, and there's still a legitimate chance that you may have 17 winners for 16 spots. When you look at Kevin Harvick, who's continued to struggle, I mean, he's on the verge of back-to-back winless seasons, a 58-race winless streak. Chase Elliott leads the standings, NASCAR's most popular driver. But the biggest storyline for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, we saw it going into the bye week. Daniel Suarez gets his first win. Trackhouse Racing has burst onto the scene, and they appear to have speed every single week.
Yeah, I mean, what an impressive start to the season this team's had. I mean, here's the deal. Ross Chastain has been a talented driver in any vehicle he's ever been in. So it was only a matter of time until, he got a car underneath him where he was capable of winning. Now, I'm a little bit more shocked with Suarez. You haven't really seen Suarez be super successful till he, since he was in, the Xfinity Series in that Gibbs car. But I'll tell you what, anyone in a Gibbs car in the Xfinity Series is going to be successful. So I wasn't super optimistic for Suarez. But here's the other thing too: he was a young guy, and I think he's learned a lot. And for me, I kind of had this. I'm not quite sure how good Suarez is, and I kind of faded him early in the season. I was fortunate that he wrecked it. I think it was Vegas when I faded him. But I'll tell you what, I am afraid to fade him now. He is definitely a contender on road courses, and every now and then he'll catch a setup on an oval, and he could be there to win the race. So I think it's kind of fun to see Trackhouse Racing, having Pitbull involved. I think it makes the sport fun and exciting, and also getting 23XI for them to get their first win with Jordan involved. I think that's really, really cool. As for Harvick, this guy hasn't really shown any speed at all in practice. I don't think he's really been happy with his car, with the exception of Phoenix or Sonoma. But man, does he finish well. It's unbelievable. He's almost impossible to fade because he just, with 20 to go, he's running 7th. And you're like, wow, I thought this guy had a 15th place car. So I don't know that he could win. When it comes to, will we get to 16 different winners? I don't think he can win. However, we do have, 2 plate tracks coming up. And, with guys like Blaney, Truex, Reddick, and Bell, I could see those guys winning for sure. We could even get to 17. Outside chance on 17. But Michael McDowell and Chris Buescher, there's 3 road courses coming up. Those guys were really impressive at Sonoma. I think even one of those guys could win. And if Blaney, Truex, or Reddick, or even Bell get a chance, you could see 17 winners. I don't think it'll happen, but it could.
It'd be the ultimate chaos, root for chaos type scenario in NASCAR, because what they wanted to do when they went to this playoff format was try and create that level of drama that regardless of how your season is gone, as long as you had a chance to win a race going into the postseason, that you could punch your ticket and be that Cinderella story. And one of the things for the listeners out there wondering, we talk about course types and everything else that comes along with it, we'll try and break those down a little bit as we go. So when Chris talks about road courses, we have trips to Road America where you're going to actually see NASCAR drivers make left turns. We'll go to Indianapolis for their road course as well, and one of the fastest road courses on the circuit in Watkins Glen right before we go to Daytona to close things out. So we'll try and make folks aware of mile and a half, short tracks, and everything else that goes into it. And I feel, Chris, when we talk about all this stuff and try and go through it, it begs the question, when you look at the odds to win the Cup championship, for any of the folks looking out there at some of the numbers, you're seeing a huge group of drivers. Kyle Larson, Chase Elliott, Kyle Busch, Ross Chastain, Denny Hamlin, Ryan Blaney, Joey Logano, Martin Truex, all kind of bunched up into that 12-1 range or shorter. You mentioned Kevin Harvick, who still probably wants to win a race to cement his status there. He's in that 33-1 range along with Daniel Suarez, who has already secured passage to the postseason. And then you have a variety of drivers in between. What's kind of your general philosophy when you look at big picture? Are you likely to bet the futures to win the championship, or do you kind of take a wait-and-see approach?
Well, I think early in the season, it's important to maybe take some value on guys with speed. I know that we discussed taking Chastain earlier in the year when you just saw him running up front. I mean, at that point, you're just going to take a value play, and you know what? Maybe Chastain wins a race and gets in. We didn't know after Fontana, but we just knew that they would be probably competitive, and it was worth the flyer. Because listen, like I've always been a fan of Chastain. Now, you get much past kind of that early value, and I think it gets really difficult. The first thing you have to look at when betting someone to win the championship is, can they win at where the finale is, right? So it's at Phoenix. Now, I would be saying different things right now if we were still at Homestead. I would say that Larson or like a Reddick might be a great person to have, or a great driver to have when it comes to winning the championship.
Do you want to share with our listeners how much money we've lost betting on Kyle Larson when he wasn't eligible to win the championship, and inevitably something would go wrong in that final race of the season at Homestead?
I'm lucky that I was able to pay rent. I mean, it's a joke how much money I've lost on Kyle Larson at Homestead. And then last year, when he's finally in like a fast car, he doesn't win at Homestead, and then he goes out and dominates at Sonoma. That was the first time I thought that we could be living in a simulation. I just couldn't believe my eyes. Like, how does he win? How does he win, 10 races last year, but does not win at Homestead? It's shocking.
Yeah, it's pretty wild when you look at some of these drivers, and we'll get into driver history at a lot of these tracks. It won't necessarily apply to the race that we're going to break down a little bit later in the show, because we only have one data point, as it's NASCAR's second trip to the Nashville Speedway that we'll see this weekend. But so much of what you see, it's a combination of factors. It's current form. It's the equipment that they're in. It's drivers and where they're comfortable, because you will get a number of drivers that dominate on short tracks. You'll get drivers that are great at 1.5 miles, and you'll get drivers that just feel a lot more comfortable running some of those plate track races. So to your point, can understand completely why there's not really a whole lot of value worth attacking in the quote-unquote futures market. A lot of these prices will be available, and I'm sure as we get into some of the deeper playoff discussion, when we know that field is 16, there'll be some numbers that present themselves there. So I think it's
also been momentum, right? Look at the last couple of years. Larson wins 3 of the last 4 races. Chase wins the last 2 races the year before. So we have to know who's going to have that momentum going into those final, I would say, 4 races, if you include the finale, especially when you look at, that second round, Texas, Dega, and then the Roval. That's a big giant question mark for me. Looking at those races, like to pick the winner there, or to pick the person that's actually going to maybe make it through without any wrecks. That's going to be a big question mark. So for the most part, you want to follow the momentum late in the season, but I don't know where that's going to be at this point with 20 weeks to go.
And that's one of the big things. It's knowing when you have an edge and you have an opportunity to fire, and when you kind of have to scale it back, especially if you're going to offer any of these books what can amount to a 6+ month interest-free loan. You better make sure that that's going to be the best number that you have readily available, more so than taking 8-1 and then kicking yourself heading to Martinsville, where your driver needs to win the race at a price of 12-1, knowing that you didn't have to tie up some of your liquidity going into all that. So I think it's an important discussion, and it lends itself to, one of the first topics that I want to get into as it pertains to betting NASCAR on a week-in, week-out basis, the idea of building an outright card. I think people who are more accustomed to the stick and ball sports, they're familiar with football or baseball, they may bet 1 or 2 teams, whether they're favorite teams or they're looking for a Cinderella, more so than kind of building a portfolio. So if we can start at the top line and kind of work our way through them with, how you look at pre-week odds, how you're looking at race day odds, and then we can get into some of the minutia and things that you're going to factor in with the overall handicap.
Well, and this right here is why betting on NASCAR is hands down the greatest sport to bet on. Could you imagine if you were able to bet on the Super Bowl, division winners, and every game every single week? The NFL would be even more popular to bet. But that's what NASCAR is. You get to pick a winner, you get to pick group odd winners, and you get to take matchups every single week. That's why I love NASCAR. That's why everyone that I talk to that bets NASCAR with me just becomes absolutely obsessed with it. But here's the thing. You can't bet all of those every single week. Sometimes you just have to, whenever you're betting a race, you have to make sure that everything you're kind of filtering through an odds perspective. I think we've talked about this before, that, it's not like football, or maybe you have this happen to you. Someone says, oh, I like USC this week. What's the line? How can you like USC and not know what the line is? I get the who's going to win the race this week. And I know what they're asking. They're asking who they should bet on. But for me, who I think is going to win might not always be the best bet. At the end of last year, I was saying, well, I think Kyle Larson's going to win the race, but at 2.5 to 1, I don't think that's a great bet. I think your best bets are guys like William Byron and Tyler Reddick to finish in the top 3 or top 5. I don't think that they can beat Larson, but I think they'll have a chance. And if they don't, you can still cash a ticket, whether it's top 3 or top 5. So I like to find a few guys that I think have looked good in practice and try to incorporate them into the card, whether that's in a matchup or whether it's a group bet or some of those auxiliary top 5 or top 10s. You have to be careful when, you can't just blindly bet on a guy in a matchup, because you know what? He might be a top 5 car, but he could be also running up, up against a car that may be a top 2 car, and that would be a waste of money in the long run. So you always want to identify a few cars that you think are going to be good, and then figure out a way to profit off of them through whether it's an outright, a matchup, or an auxiliary bet.
Well, I think it's an excellent point that you bring up. And I know you mentioned Kevin Harvick at the top of the show. And when you're looking at matchups, again, a lot of those folks that are listening to our podcast for the first time, and hell, they couldn't have been listening before because it is the inaugural episode of Stay Green, that they're trying to figure out how drivers get matched up with one another. And we know NASCAR has featured matchups that they make available with a number of their partners each week. But along those same lines, books are typically going to pair drivers head-to-head with one another that are working in similar equipment or expected to have similar finishes. So when you're talking about Kevin Harvick, we've grown accustomed to him needing to beat the Kyle Larsons of the world, Kyle Busch, and some of the truly elite drivers on a week-in, week-out basis. That hasn't quite been the case. While Harvick continues to struggle for speed, he's been matched up, and I mean no disrespect with this, to some of the second-tier drivers that are out there, not the guys that are being priced at 4.5 or 5 to 1 to win on a weekly basis. So Harvick, by virtue of that, may not be the guy you're looking to try and catch lightning in a bottle with at 40 to 1 to win outright. But as a result, if you can catch him as a small underdog in some of the head-to-heads, it provides you a different betting vehicle than what people would be looking for. And I think, to your point, it's why there are so many different ways to attack the betting board each and every week with a NASCAR race. There's not a right number of bets or wrong number of bets to make every Saturday or Sunday that you're going to the window. Some weeks you're going to see a driver that you feel is grossly undervalued by the betting market. You may want to bet on him in all of his matchups. Another week you may find a driver that you really dislike, and it's as profitable a scenario in this, much like if you're betting golf, that betting against a driver that you don't think is going to have a good day can be as profitable as betting on a driver that's going to have a good day. And the difference in this, and I'll let you kind of take it from there, Worm, is that the element that no one wants to talk about when they're handicapping NASCAR versus other sports, even if you have the best car, a mechanical failure going against you can allow you to cash 2 or 3 matchups because one driver had a bad pit stop or an improperly placed lug nut.
Yeah, and I think that I would say that's even more so this year. This new car is quite edgy. You see guys that have kind of snapped loose in the middle, running kind of around nobody. So I think that cars that have been able to pass this year have been great handling race cars. They've been able to kind of run the bottom and the top. Otherwise, it's been very difficult to pass. So to your point, you definitely can make money fading cars that are handling poorly. And I mean that because they're probably going to be running in traffic. They probably didn't qualify well. And when you don't qualify well, you have a poor pit stall. And this year, with only one lug nut, you're seeing pit times much tighter. And you could have a loose race car that all of a sudden is just going to kind of snap loose. And if you're fading, let's just say Kurt Busch across the board, and he snaps loose because he has a loose race car, you could go ahead and sweep the board, and by betting against him or fading him in his matchups.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And I think every sport that people bet on is always going to have a very different nuance. And as we get deeper and deeper into how NASCAR odds are structured, how the betting markets will move, I think it'll create a little bit of a clearer picture for those folks that may never have bet a race and will be looking at an odds board for the first time this weekend when we go to Nashville. And to your point, it's not just that you have to bet before the cars are on track with qualifying. You have an opportunity to bet into some of these head-to-head matchups early in the week. Prices will adjust based on what we've seen from on-track activity. You're going to see the outright odds, the top fives, the top tens, group bets. All of those other markets are going to shift. And the question I have for you, when you look at the board, do you do most of your betting on race day, or do you try and build as much of your card as you can going in, thinking that you're going to have a better opportunity to guess where these cars are going to be before books can adjust, given what they've seen through practice and qualifying?
Yeah, I'd way rather bet after practice and qualifying. It might not necessarily be, on race day. Like, for example, this week, qualifying is on Saturday, but practice is on Friday. So I will try to get as many bets out, on Friday once I've watched practice. But, here's the thing. If, let's just say you like a guy, like, I think Chastain's going to be good this week, but he doesn't qualify super well. And so right now he's 8-1. I'd rather see him in practice and bet on him at 7-1 if he looks good in practice and not feel like I'm just kind of blindly wagering on someone. The only time I really like to make a bet early in the week, which I would say, or pre-week, kind of before practice and qualifying, would be someone who has the opportunity to really have their odds drop. Remember, this is not like horse betting. You're not just gonna whatever they go off at. Someone's actually taking your action, and you're locked in at that price. So if you can lock someone in at say 18 or 20-1, and they happen to qualify well and look good in practice, and maybe they go down to 10-1, well, that's just going to reduce the sports book's hold and provide you an opportunity to make money after practice once those odds adjust. Because let's just say that Truex qualifies well and he goes down to 6-1. Well, now odds of every other driver are going to increase slightly, giving you better odds on other drivers to help protect your Truex bet.
No, it makes a ton of sense. I think you see that a lot of times as well in, some of the other sports. I mean, there's no reason to run to the window and bet a favorite and take 4-1 before a season starts when in the NFL Week 8 you can find a way to get plus 350 and avoid injury or anything else that'll come along with it. So I think it's a valuable lesson for folks who want to run to try and get their money in. It's not the end of the world. And trust me, I'm going to get killed by this comment. There's plenty of things we're going to say through gambling Twitter and folks who have to get that 0.5% edge here and there. You and I look at this very differently. We'd feel more comfortable knowing that we had a good piece we were betting on, taking a ticket at 14-1, more so than betting it, throwing a dart early in the week, trying to lock up a number in that 18-20 range. On the off chance that, hey, look, we mishandicapped it, the car didn't unload the right way, it gets shuffled all the way to the back, and suddenly you can get a significantly higher number on race day. So I think it's an extremely valuable point that when you're looking to build an outright card, don't put all of your chips in the middle of the table before you know what these cars are going to look like, because having a variety of different books you can work off, you're going to see that disparity in price, and it's going to give you ample opportunity to try and do that. One thing I do want to say as well for those folks who have grown accustomed to us kind of offering up best bets, it's a little bit different in NASCAR. What we're going to try and do each week when we do have what we feel is some of the best wagering opportunities that are there is to offer up a head-to-head matchup once there's a lot more liquidity in the market. It's not going to do anybody any favors if you and I, Worm, are giving out matchups on Friday. People are betting into them, and they're not going to have a chance. So we'll look at the board, and we're going to do our best every Sunday when we see, or Saturday, depending on the case, when races may be run, to offer that up on the Bet the Board website. So encourage people to go check that out. We'll get those up as early as possible once the majority of sports books have hung prices. And you mentioned some of the on-track activities. Perfect time to remind all of you to follow Chris on Twitter. That's at Chris Wormy, ChrisWerme15. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me on Twitter as well. And coming off of the bye, NASCAR will make the move from Fox Sports over to NBC, and we're hoping all of you guys that as we can get you fully immersed in the NASCAR betting culture that you guys are going to watch practice as much as anybody else. So things will kick off Friday afternoon. You're going to get trucks on the track, 4:30 Eastern. That'll be on FS1. We'll switch things over to USA as part of NBC's coverage for the Xfinity Series at 5:35 Eastern. The Cup practice that Chris talked about a little bit earlier, that'll be 6:30 Eastern. And then the trucks race live from Nashville will be on FS1 at 8. If you're looking for Saturday activities, Xfinity qualifying goes at noon Eastern. You'll get Cup qualifying at 1, and you get the Tennessee Lottery 250 at 3:30 Eastern. Those events all taking place on USA. And then, of course, the Cup race, the Ally 400, 5 Eastern, a little bit of a late start time on Sunday. That'll be on NBC. So for those folks that want to try and watch as much racing as they possibly can, those are all of your track times for this coming weekend. And Worm, that gives us the perfect segue into what everybody is here to break down. That, of course, the Ally 400 from Nashville. A 1.3-mile track, ran here for the first time last year. Kyle Larson led a race-high 264 laps. 88% of the 300 laps he led. Larson, of course, enters this week without his crew chief and Cliff Daniels because of a loose wheel at Sonoma. 2 other crew team members will be suspended as well. But that's not stopped the odds makers from making Larson the favorite every book you look at. I've seen him at a low of 4.5 to 1, upwards of 6. When you're talking about Kyle Larson, we know this season hasn't been as charmed as last year, but the 5 seems to bring speed each and every week. What's the outlook look like for Kyle Larson this week in Nashville?
I mean, hasn't been as charmed might be an understatement. I mean, the biggest surprise of the year, listen to this stat, Todd. Kyle Larson has won 2 stages at this point this year.
That's insane.
He has 2 stage wins. Just imagine if you walked up to the window and you were looking at odds for this year's season and it said, oh, through 16 weeks, we think that Kyle Larson's stage win total will be 2.5. How many people would be betting the under in that scenario? I mean, none.
None. I'm going to go with none, including anybody tied to HMS or in Kyle Larson's family.
I mean, I can't believe this. The fact that he's only won 2 stages is kind of, I think you can tell where I'm headed with this. Last year was a completely different year. I mean, we saw, I think, the most dominant season in NASCAR, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, I think he led the most laps ever. It was super impressive. But this year it hasn't been the same. If you look at his dominant performance last year, he started 5th, but with the early cautions, I think after like 3/4 of a green flag lap, he was in the lead. I don't even think it was a full lap. He was already in first. But remember, coming into this race, he had won 2 races previous to this, and the 3 races before that, he had finished second, which he could have easily won those. So I think he had a little bit more momentum coming into this week than he had in.
Yeah,
he had more momentum last year than he did this year.
And no, you're right. I mean, when you look at Larson, I think all of us forget that he hadn't won that many races, but the speed was there week in, week out. He was consistently running inside the top 5 with some of those top 3 finishes that you alluded to, and you knew it was just a matter of time before he got everything right and was going to be able to basically stack up wins on top of one another. I don't think any of us anticipated that would be the dominant run we saw over the second half of the season leading to the Cup championship. But by the same token, we haven't seen that level of dominance at all this year. We talked about it earlier in the show with so many different winners. I mean, you could go through Ross Chastain, 2 race wins. Denny Hamlin, 2 race wins. And Hamlin has been the model of inconsistency. I mean, he's got more finishes outside the top 20 than any of those proverbial top 10 drivers.
He won at Richmond with a 3-legged donkey.
Hey,
I mean, that was his quote before the race.
You can't trash strategy either. You can't trash strategy. We know it can pay dividends since he happened to take tires at the right juncture in that race. And then you look at, William Byron, who had a couple races that he won earlier this year, but hasn't run well over the last 5 to 7 races. So it just goes to show that one of these teams is going to hit their setup, and I have a feeling that they're going to try and rattle off 5 top 5s in the course of 7 weeks, but we haven't seen it yet. And I think you're of the same mindset as me that trying to back a driver like Kyle Larson at 5 to 1 going into Nashville, despite how dominant he was last year, I need to see it to believe it. I need to see that 5-lap average. I need to see that 10-lap average, and I need to read quotes where Larson believes he's got a car that can get to the front, it can start at the front, and dominate from start to finish, instead of a lot of the self-inflicted wounds we've seen from the 5 team all year.
Well, the other thing too is I don't think he's adjusted his car very well. I mean, he always qualifies pretty well and always kind of has run, top 3 to 5, but he never, makes an adjustment that kind of is like, oh, my car's great now. I can run the line I want to run and I can make passes. I just haven't seen that. I think I've seen that more out of Gibbs than I have Hendrick just in general. I mean, it's kind of funny that we haven't really seen anyone dominate a race outside of maybe Martinsville. You could say that Byron was pretty dominant, or at least Hendrick was dominant. I think going into Gateway, we thought that the Fords were going to be dominant. I think that race played out a little differently than I think everyone anticipated. So it's interesting. This is kind of the first time in NASCAR where, or at least since I've been following it, where I don't think that there's a clear favorite to win this week. And in the past, we could say, hey, I think you just bet, Kyle Busch, Truex, and Larson, and your card would be done. And that's what's kind of exciting about this is I truly don't know. I think I have an idea of who's going to be best, but I don't know until they ultimately unload. So I think it's kind of exciting, to be this far into the season and not know who that dominant team is.
Yeah, and I mean, you're looking at the odds board right now. I mean, 12 to 15 drivers, depending on the shop, all at prices of 25 to 1 or less. So you talk about parity. Parity creates opportunity for those folks that build their race card in the right manner. When you look at the racing surface at Nashville, I mean, they added resin to the track last year, provided for multi-groove racing in the older generation cars. What was interesting, reading some comments this week leading up to the race, that Joey Logano was pretty forthright, said he doesn't think there's actually a comparison at a track they've raced at this season for what they're going to encounter in Nashville. Now, drivers can say one thing. We look at things very differently. So when you started to go through handicapping, trying to figure out what you could use as previous comps, were there a couple of tracks that you went, you know what? These are the ones I'm going to look at. I'm going to try and figure out exactly who was good there and how some of this may potentially translate to Sunday's race.
Yeah, this is, you can find a lot of this stuff in the tire notes that'll usually be an indication of where to look, but they're not always right as well. So for me, I think Dover is probably the best comparable track just because it's, the concrete. So it's going to have the kind of you'd think similar tire wear. I know that obviously Dover's going to be a little bit faster, but also it's going to be the same right side tire as Darlington, Kansas, and Charlotte, which I find surprising because I didn't think that those are pretty high tire wear tracks relative to what I expect in Nashville. So what that means for me is I think that this is going to be a strategy race. You're going to want to find yourself at the front on a proper tire strategy. I think you'll see guys take 2 and 4 tires. And whenever this happens, I get a little squeamish because I just don't know the strategy that each team plans on implementing towards the end of the race. So that's why I also threw in Gateway. So I guess to round off the 5 tracks that I'm looking at, and it's nice because they're kind of the most recent tracks as well, would be Gateway, Charlotte, Kansas, Darlington, and Dover. I would probably discount Darlington, Charlotte a little bit just because they do have a little bit more fall off than what I expect to see and what you saw at Gateway and what you would see at Dover. But yeah, we ultimately don't know. Anyone that says that they're 100% sure on what they expect to see this week, I would take that with maybe a grain of salt because the drivers don't even know. And Logano is actually really good at Nashville. He was great there in the Xfinity Series. So I would trust Logano. That's probably the only thing I would trust Joey Logano when he says something that. I would agree that he probably doesn't know.
Yeah, and that's not a personal indictment of anything that Joey says. It's reading the tea leaves. We know that all of these guys have great poker faces, and when you handicap NASCAR on a week in, week out basis, some guys are going to give you an honest assessment of the kind of car they have. Others will be a little bit more tight-lipped. So Joey's not always honest with the kind of car we can anticipate. But the one thing I will say, winning at Gateway, he may have won in unconventional fashion, but there's no doubt going into the race, he had the best and fastest car, and rightfully so went off as a 6-1 favorite. Yeah,
he was great in that race. And the other thing, too, is I know that I was pretty heavy on him. I probably shouldn't have been. Looking back, I mean, I expected him to dominate the race based on practice. and he didn't. I think that he was kind of fortunate to be on that right tire strategy to get himself the track position. And now when that happens and you find yourself kind of running in the first, or restarting in the first 2 lanes with Kyle Busch, if you have a better handling car, maybe he was able, I think he drove to the inside to kind of get that win. But, it's funny you say you have to, take kind of interpret what drivers mean when they talk about their car. I mean, if Kyle Busch says, well, it doesn't suck, that means his car's amazing. Because sometimes the negativity you can hear on his radio is like, whoa, oh my gosh. Does someone want to remind him he's running third? So if Kyle Busch says his car doesn't suck, then you should probably bet on him because that means it's great.
Some of these guys, I mean, to your point, for those folks who want to try and take advantage, I always encourage you to check out NASCAR.com, and for the in-race radio, you'll get some great unfiltered feedback from the drivers in terms of what's going on. And I think one of the best storylines from this season, talking about all that, wasn't with Kyle Busch, it was with another Kyle, when Kyle Larson in the 600 was having a disastrous race through the first 2 stages, going back and forth with crew chief Cliff Daniels talking about my car's terrible, I'm wrecking this thing. And you hear the crew chief basically go, hey, look, take a deep breath. We're going to reset. It's a long enough race that you can figure things out. And I think it's a lot of those mental gymnastics that people don't always incorporate for which drivers can maintain that level, even keel, because things aren't going to go smoothly for all 300 or 400 laps of a race. How do you deal with adversity? Where can you make up positions on pit road? And what can you do off some of those valuable late race restarts to pick up 2 or 3 different spots, whether it's with 2 fresh tires or 4 fresh tires, as the case may be?
Yeah, that race is just a marathon. It's so hard to, handicap that race because usually they practice during the day. And they're trying to anticipate where the track's going to go, but they ultimately don't know. I try not to get too discouraged if I have guys. And I only, full disclosure, I only had Chastain and Larson in that race. Yeah, I mean, and I was at the race too, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, you know what? Hold on one second.
Until the very end.
Why don't you, I think that's a great story to tell as well, though, in terms of, sharing with people the story and why you were actually at that race. I think they'll find it extremely heartfelt, and it'll peel back the curtain a little bit on who Chris Wormy is as an individual, not just as a racing analyst.
Yeah, so we've obviously been in talks with NASCAR for a while to try to get this podcast going, and once that had happened, I'd always kind of had circled the Coke 600 is, I've always wanted to do this essentially. And, my brother, he was in the military and struggled with PTSD when he got out, and was only around for about 6 months after he got out of the Marines. And so as NASCAR being the most patriotic sport on earth, they always list a fallen soldier's name at the top of the place on the top of the windshield for the drivers. And I reached out to NASCAR and I said, hey, I don't know if this is something you can do, but I'd love to get my brother's name on a car. And I was too little too late, and they didn't have any more cars available. So they still wanted to help, and they put my brother's name, Sergeant Patrick Wormy, on the pace car. And so it was really, really cool to get to go to that event. And that kind of capped off an amazing day. To be honest, I was at the Indy 500 for that race. I wanted to check it out. And then we were able to also, take a jet down to Charlotte and watch that race. Unfortunately, we had a little bit of an issue, so I wasn't able to, watch the whole race, or at least see the car before the pace car before the race went green. But ultimately, it was nice. My parents went down there, and I was able to meet up with them, with about 100 to go, and just enough time to rip up my Chastain and Larson tickets that didn't look good all night. But ultimately, it was kind of a once in a lifetime day to do the double as a fan and as someone that kind of was able to have kind of a sentimental value. I mean, big thanks to NASCAR for hosting my mom and my stepmom and my dad. It was an awesome day.
Yeah, different level of connection for sure. And to your point, talking about NASCAR and everything they do for the service, most patriotic sport far and away. in this country, no doubt. And so I'm glad you had the chance to do that. Obviously wish it was under better circumstances. The silver lining to you only getting there with 100 laps left, I think it took about 3.5 hours of real time to run those final 100 laps, though, with all the caution flags late. So at least you got to see your full day of racing.
Well, and I got to see my brother's name on the pace car a lot, even for the last 100 laps. So I guess that would be the silver lining is, he was being honored often. Unfortunately, I could have gone without that last caution. I think that, but hey, to Chase Briscoe's credit, he raced Larson clean. I hope he learned his lesson after what he did at Bristol and kind of really hurt Reddick's chances, obviously, of winning the race. So I'm all for good, clean racing. So I'm glad that Briscoe was able to not kind of, wreck Larson while racing aggressively. I thought it was really good for the sport.
Yeah, and I think we've seen some of those rivalries start to manifest themselves. It'll be interesting as the stakes get ratcheted up, how some of the chips to cash in that drivers have with one another and axes to grind could play out over the final 10 weeks of the regular season. But getting back to Nashville, we talked about a couple of drivers. You mentioned some of the track comps that are out there. Who are a couple of the drivers that you have your eye on in terms of performing well that you feel should be legitimate players this Sunday in the Ally 400?
Well, I think that the first person you have to look at would be Ross Chastain. I think he's kind of been the most consistent driver throughout the whole season. He definitely raced well at those tracks where they use this tire as well. The other guy would be Kyle Busch. I don't think I'm shocking anybody with my expert analysis here, but those guys really have stood out.
What, you mean you're not gonna take guys at 7-1 and 8-1 every single race for as long as we do this and tell people that's how you're seeking value?
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, but here's the thing. We were able to cash a bigger Ross Chastain tickets earlier in the year, and you have to do that before, it's like when Larson hadn't had his first win. You knew it was eventually coming, but were you going to get the odds and get the payoff you deserved? And I think we did at Michigan when he got or Michigan or California, wherever he got his first win. But I think that if you look at some of these other guys, when it comes to their average finish over those 5 races that I was talking about, it kind of paints a little bit different picture. Chris Bell, his average finish over those 5 races is actually 5.8, which is incredible. That's way better than Kyle Busch, who's rated at 9.4. And then, believe it or not, Ricky Stenhouse over those 5 races as the 3rd best average finish. So I don't think it's any secret out there in the Twitter world that Ricky Stenhouse has some value on himself this week. But also another guy like Truex, who hasn't really run up front. He also has a great average finish. So officially, I would say that I think the favorite should be Ross Chastain. Obviously, we need to take a look at practice. But for the most part, I think that the value lies in Ricky Stenhouse in some form this week. I don't know that he can win the race. I haven't seen Stenhouse have race-winning speed since he was in the 6 car in the Xfinity Series. So not at a plate track. So, I think Chastain should be the favorite. Like I said, I'm not going to play anything from an outright perspective yet. I think that if someone wants to nibble, maybe Chris Bell to win the pole, I think there might be some value there. He's qualified super well on this tire, and when he looked poor in practice at Gateway, he qualified well. So.
Yeah, Bell's been interesting because he's the driver that almost becomes the forgotten man in the JGR stable. And when you look at how he's run at some of the comparable tracks that we're using to factor into our equation this week, Kyle Busch has been the gold standard. We talked a little bit earlier about the model of inconsistency that Denny Hamlin, when you look at his finishes throughout the course of the season, 31st at Sonoma, 34th at Gateway, where he finished a handful of laps off the pace, and none other than the top 5 finishes at 1.5 miles at Kansas and Charlotte. I mean, you're talking 21, 21, 18, 35, 28 before he had the win on strategy at Richmond. But even Martin Truex, he does have a couple of 6th-place finishes smattered in over his last 4 races. But Christopher Bell, to your point, you talked about the average finish, the 27th at Sonoma, where I don't think any JGR car hit their setup for the road track, 9th at Gateway, 5th at Charlotte, 5th at Kansas, 6th at Darlington, 4th at Dover, and he had a 6th-place finish at Richmond earlier in the year. So Christopher Bell may be that guy getting closer and closer to grabbing the checkered flag that offers some value coming into the week. So,
well, here's the thing. If you don't get Chris Bell before the race, you can certainly get him live after his first pit road penalty or maybe his second pit road penalty when he goes to the rear. So if you don't get him at like a 15-1, I wouldn't be too upset, because there will be another opportunity if you want to bet live, because that guy, along with Denny Hamlin, just love to go to the rear, and it's very frustrating when you have him in matchups. But ultimately, that guy can pass cars. And there's some people, I think, like someone like Ryan Blaney, who hasn't, if he's gone to the rear, it's taken him a long time to get back to the front, where I think Hamlin and Bell have done a good job with, I guess, a lot of practice from going from the rear and getting a good solid finish.
What do you, in your opinion, what do you think that says about the cars and some of the setups? Do you feel like JGR is getting more out of their cars in traffic, where some of the Penske cars, they're great running in clean air? Ryan Blaney's had race-winning speed on multiple occasions this year. And Joey Logano, the same kind of thing. You look at Joey Logano, he's got 2 wins in his last 5 races, but in those other races, he's been 17th or worse in 5 out of the last 7. So when he gets up front, he can win, but he hasn't shown the ability to consistently navigate through traffic if things aren't going smoothly in front of him.
Yeah, and I don't know how much differently these cars handle to cars in the past. I mean, those JGR guys, those are wheelmen that race for that team, and it's not a slight to anyone else. But, I mean, I think that it goes to straight to handling. I don't think that raw speed is... Obviously, speed is important, but I think in order to pass, you have to be able to run a different lane than the guy that you're trying to pass. And, you see it at Michigan, where there's a lot of just one lane racing, and the guy that can win, it's one of two things. He's the guy that, takes the lead on the final restart, or it's the guy that works maybe a little bit below the groove or a little bit above the groove and is able to make a pass. So maybe Gibbs has just a setup where they're just looking for more stability, so that way they can make moves and make passes mid-pack. But I don't think the Fords have done that very well at all. I mean, if Blaney gets mired back in traffic, he really struggles to get back to the lead, or even become, it's almost like he's not even a part of the race anymore at some point. So he really, really needs to stay up front when it comes to track position, because I just don't think that he has or his car has the handling he needs to make passes and work his way back up through the field.
All extremely valuable things that I think a lot of our listeners are going to monitor. Some of this may sound Greek to them when they inevitably sit down with a case of their favorite adult beverage on Sunday and they watch the Ally 400 from start to finish. But that's what we're here for, and want you guys to interact with us. We know this is the inaugural episode of Stay Green, and we're going to continue to do our part to educate, entertain, and inform you guys about some of the best ways to go about betting NASCAR, make you more comfortable with the sport, as we continue to do these shows each and every week until we get to the championship in early November in Phoenix. But Worm, there are a lot of listeners here that have been with Bet the Board since our inception back in 2014, and they know this is the time of show where me as host, I get to throw the baton, or in this case, I can lob the ball at the rim to the analyst, which is normally Payne. You're going to fill that role on this show going forward for Stay Green. If you can make one investment right now for a best bet, is there anything that you'd encourage our listeners to jump on before we share any potential matchups that have caught our eye on the website Sunday morning when there's a little bit more liquidity in the market?
Yeah, I like Ricky Stenhouse to finish in the top 10 at 2-1. I think you can find that on FanDuel. Listen, he's had some great finishes. He had a rocky start to the season. On top of those just recent great finishes, he's really good on concrete. He's good at Bristol. He's been good at Dover in the past. I am not ready to invest in him in a top 5 or even a win type scenario, mainly because he doesn't qualify well. And if you don't qualify well, you don't get a good pit stall. And this year, I think pit stall selection is really, really important. And the last thing you want to do is lose 2 or 3 spots on pit road because you don't have an easy entry or exit, and you end up passing the same cars over and over again. I do think that throughout the race, he's going to work his way forward. He ran well here last year. I think he finished second and was running competitive lap times. I would say the bet that I would like everyone, if you're interested, to lock in would be that 2-1 Ricky Stenhouse top 10.
And as always, like we've told our bettors from day one, and we'll continue to tell you going forward, make sure you have a number of sports books at your disposal. Shop around, as NASCAR prices will vary a lot more than some of the traditional sports you've grown accustomed to betting in the past. So you want to get those best of the numbers. And to Worm's point, talking about, the potential closing line value. If Stenny has a rough qualifying session, you may even be able to get a better number on Sunday, but that's the price where we've invested in the market. 2-1, obviously you can find better. Go ahead and take it. And like we said, if there are any head-to-head matchups, most likely we'll have at least one or two that we can share with you on Sunday. Chris, you've officially put your first podcast in the can. You get to do this every single Wednesday. So this is like preseason. This is training wheels. Do you feel comfortable, or are you going to engage with our whole social community? I don't want you going off on any rants if people decide they want to get in your grill and telling you know nothing about the sport.
Yeah, that doesn't bother me. To be honest, this is not a competition, me and another NASCAR bettor or anyone. This is us versus the sports books, right? There's two sides. And you know what? If someone wants to bring something to my attention or say that I'm wrong, I have no problem with that. Just give me the reason, because without that explanation, it's going to be really hard for me to say you're right or you're wrong. So I definitely want to kind of use this like hive mind process where we can actually have a little give and take. And like I said, the goal is to make money, and it's us versus them in this scenario. And if someone has some comments or some questions, I'm happy to answer, or even talk through things. This is also great for just myself as handicapping this, because this is something I did alone. I didn't really talk about it. And so I've learned a lot just kind of preparing for this, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the season.
Hey, it should be a lot of fun. We got a lot more of these shows to do. Want to say thanks again to NASCAR for jumping on board. Collaboration project with Bet the Board Media, essentially, at this time. We know what kind of expectations we hold ourselves to around these parts, and NASCAR will be no different. Chris is one of the best in the business, and you'll come to appreciate all of his levels of knowledge, expertise, and discipline when it comes to making money at the track every weekend. So for all of you, our loyal listeners who are tuning in to Stay Green for the very first time, we wish you nothing but the best of luck. And with a Ricky Stenhouse top 10 ticket in hand on Sunday afternoon of the Ally 400, we'll see you at the window.